All right, folks. Hopefully, Stuart can jump in here. I am not a microeconometrician, but I do know some of the underlying logic of our chosen method and the data as well. So I'll do my best to do that justice. If anything is incorrect, I blame Stuart. So thank you everybody for being here today. My name is Michael Sierra Arevalo. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at UT Austin. My thanks to the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center for their generous funding and belief in this project, as well as to Dr. Craig, who's at the Wisconsin School of Business, and our three research assistants, Aiden Bach, Ciara Garcia, and Philip Pham, who were integral to the coding of the data that we use in this project. So as you can see from the title of this talk, we're focused on the effect of permitless carry legislation on police firearm injury in the United States. Next slide, please. So we are focused specifically on legislation that affects the concealed carrying of firearms. So unlike other legislation, which is focused on what is referred to as open carry, so something like a holster on somebody's hip where you can see their firearm, similar to how you might see a police officer carry their firearm, or the open carrying of a rifle on someone's shoulder, we're focused on legislation that is looking at firearms that are concealed, most often in the context of somebody's waistband, but this would include concealed firearms in the context of something like a fanny pack, a backpack, a ankle holster, things of that nature. Next slide, please. Now, until relatively recently, about the past 15, 20 years or so, the main distinction that was drawn for legislation that affected the carrying of concealed firearms was focused on the issuance of licenses or permits to carry a concealed firearm. And there was a big distinction here between shall issue states, in which if you were an individual who was able to own firearms, meaning not a prohibited possessor, such as somebody with a felony record, you would be issued a permit in a shall carry state if you were qualified. That could include things like a training course. And then in may issue states, you could be fully qualified through something like a training course, but the ultimate issuance of that license would fall to local officials, very often police officers. Notably, may issue states are increasingly rare, and currently only Delaware and Connecticut continue to operate as may issue states. Next slide, please. Now, very recently, this distinction has become less salient because of changes in what is known as permitless carry. Next slide, please. Now, unlike shall issue and may issue legislation, which is focused on individuals that are qualified or certified, usually again through training, sometimes through a written exam, to get a permitless carry permit. Permitless carry, as you can see, also known as constitutional carry, changes the regulation around the concealed carrying of firearms such that individuals who are not prohibited possessors, very often 21 plus, though there are exceptions in some states for 18 plus who are military, can now carry a concealed firearm without any training, without any licensing, without any essentially state oversight beyond the initial background check for, say, purchasing a firearm at an FFL. But if you, for example, were to purchase a firearm through a private seller or at a gun show, you would simply be able to put that gun into your waistband in permitless carry states and legally carry that firearm, assuming that you are not a prohibited possessor. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, this became particularly salient over the course of the past 15 to 20 years. Up until around 2012 to 2014, there were only a handful of states that had permitless carry. But what we saw from 2014 on was a sharp increase in the number of states that have passed permitless carry legislation, allowing this permitless or constitutional carry of concealed firearms in their state. As of 2024, there were a total of 29 states. So now the majority of states in the United States have permitless carry. This will become salient near the end of our presentation when I talk about some of the limitations of this work. This is a rapidly moving legislative landscape. But I believe as of 2024, the newest states are South Carolina and Louisiana's permitless carry goes into effect of July 4th, 2024. So if that's any indication of how quickly this is moving, we made these slides about a week ago and they are already out of date. And so we'll come back to some of those methodological considerations in just a moment. Next slide, please. Now, there are two main concerns that we're focusing on in the context of this project. The first is public safety, and the second, which is the main focus, is officer safety, and as that relates to permitless carry legislation. Next slide, please. Now, recent research has shown that permitless carry is related to an increase in firearm injury and firearm death. That's work by Lundstrom as well as Doucette and colleagues very recently, showing that the passage of permitless carry specifically is related to an increase in firearm suicide, firearm assaults, as well as police shootings, meaning the shooting of individuals who are non-police by police officers in the United States. Next slide, please. The question, however, of how permitless carry affects officer safety is still an open one. Next slide, please. And this is particularly salient because police officers themselves in multiple states that have since passed permitless carry have highlighted the potential risk posed by a lack of licensure and a lack of training, and in more individuals carrying firearms for officer safety, meaning more individuals will have firearms, more individuals with firearms will be contacted by police, and this poses potential risks to the safety of police officers. However, next slide, please. The empirical question remains: does passage of permitless carry affect rates of police firearm injury in the United States? Next slide, please. So now moving to data and method. Next slide, please. To answer this question, we draw on data that is collected by the Gun Violence Archive. This is a nonprofit entity that collects and collates free information data on firearm injury across all kinds of firearm injury. So this is accidents, this is suicides, homicides, assaults, and it's across essentially anybody that is fatally or non-fatally struck by a round fired from a firearm. They're collected from approximately 7,500 media, police, and government sources, and then they are often hand-checked by individuals who work for the archive. Next slide, please. So we use a specific subset of this data set. I've been working with these data since approximately 2019 with other colleagues such as Justin Nix at the University of Nebraska-Omaha, and we are focused on fatal and non-fatal firearm injuries that are suffered by local, sheriff, and state law enforcement officers who are on duty at the time that they are shot. That includes being struck directly by a bullet. That includes having any of their on-person equipment, such as a radio or ballistic shield or helmet struck by a bullet, as well as by bullet fragments. And they are rounds that are shot by a suspect. This means that we are excluding cases, for example, of what is known as blue-on-blue shootings, which can be accidental very often. We're excluding incidents of pellet guns or paintball guns. We're excluding explosives. We're specifically looking at instances of a suspect shooting a round that strikes an officer or their equipment. We do not count what you might refer to as near misses, such as a round missing an officer. We also don't count incidents of an officer's vehicle being struck. And so we're trying to kind of walk this middle line. What do we include or not include? So we do include non-fatal cases. We do include things like cement or glass as a result of a firearm being shot that then strikes an officer. And we cover all of these cases from 2014 through 2023. And we believe this to be the best data available on fatal and non-fatal firearm injury that affects police officers. And the timing could not be better. Next slide, please. We're going to transition now into some of the general trends. This is a look at 2014 through 2023. This is the rate of injuries, firearm injuries, fatal and non-fatal, of police officers in the US per 10,000 officers. As you can see, there is a slight longitudinal increase over time. Overall, the trend is relatively stable. There is strong seasonality here with increases in the summer across individual years. And it remains a statistically rare phenomenon, noting, of course, that officers in the US are shot far more often than their counterparts in peer OECD nations. So with these broad trends in mind, next slide, please, I want to move us to a consideration of a particular case, my home state of Texas, which recently passed, next slide, please, permitless carry, which went into effect in 2021. So again, like other states, officers and law enforcement agencies in the state expressed concern about the passage of permitless carry. Nonetheless, this was signed into law by Governor Abbott, and permitless carry took effect in September of 2021. Next slide. So at this point, I'll turn it over to my collaborator, Dr. Stuart Craig at the Wisconsin Business School, who'll walk us through the logic of our analysis using a difference in difference approach.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. Can everyone hear me? Yes. All right. Terrific. Okay. So we're going to think about Texas as an example that helps us build the intuition of how we're approaching estimating what permitless carry does to these injury rates. So the first thing is we'll look at the trend in officer injury rates before and after permitless carry in Texas. And then we'll think about how we can statistically understand what's happening in Texas relative to places that, for example, don't have permitless carry. So if we go to the next slide, please. Here we have the officer injury rate in Texas for 2014 through 2023. And I've grayed out 2021, which is the year in which Texas passes permitless carry legislation. And you can see that these rates are kind of noisy, right? They're all over the place. And if we go to the next slide, adding a moving average to this is going to help us actually understand what's happening with the trend a little bit. Obviously, the moving average is noisier in the later period where we have fewer points to average over. But you can see that this trend is slightly upward sloping over time, but pretty low and pretty flat, similar to what's happening in the national trend. And the thing that we're really trying to do here is think about, okay, well, we know what happened to the trend in Texas. What we don't know is what would have happened in Texas if the permitless carry legislation hadn't been passed, right? And so what the difference in difference approach is really about is trying to think about using other comparisons to other states or to the national trend to think about what would have happened in Texas had this not occurred. And we can kind of think about, are these things trending together before permitless carry passes? And are they trending together, or is there some deviation in Texas once permitless carry passes? So if we go to the next slide, that's really what we're going to do, and I'll show you some examples in Texas, and then we'll go and look at all permitless carry passage together in a regression framework. So if we go to the next slide, we'll be able to look at California, which is another large state and maybe a good comparison for that reason. And you can see that these the trends in California are also noisy. They seem to be kind of moving together beforehand. Maybe the gap between the two is widening a little bit. Notably, Texas has a much higher rate of officer gun injuries than California does, both in the pre and the post period. And that's one of the differences. So when we say difference in difference, part of what we're doing is we're subtracting out that level difference between California and Texas and not really thinking about that. The question is there a second difference in the post period that is leading us to believe that something is changing in the gap between Texas and California once permitless carry goes into effect? So you might also think, if we look at Florida, that's another good comparison state, in particular because Florida actually passes permitless carry later in 2023. So if you thought that there was something special about trends in states that do pass permitless carry, Florida is perhaps a better comparison in some sense if you think that permitless carry legislation is somehow comes in response to changes in gun violence in the first place. But again, here we're kind of seeing similar trends before and after. It's obviously sort of difficult to tell in the context of this graph because the numbers individually are fairly noisy. But if we go to, I think we were going to go forward 2 slides here. There's a header slide. Oh, we're going to 3 slides. So we can also do this with the national average, and you can see these things are kind of trending together before and after permitless carry passes. All right, so let's skip ahead 2 slides here. So we can put that all in a regression, and what we're doing here is thinking about all of the 12 states that passed permitless carry between 2016 and 2021. And so those are states for which we're going to be able to observe 2 years before and 2 years after the permitless carry legislation passes, so that we can kind of think about, are these things trending together beforehand, and is there some deviation in the post period? So here we're comparing these states to these 12 states that passed permitless carry in that time period to the 28 states that either never passed permitless carry at all or passed permitless carry legislation in the future. And you can see that there's really not too much going on, right? All of these estimates, both before and after permitless carry, are hovering around 0. So there's not really a detectable change there. The lines around those coefficient estimates are a confidence interval. And so what that means is that we can confidently reject increases in injury rates in permitless carry states of at least 4 per 10,000. Again, you might think that there's something special about permitless carry states, and so the only good comparisons are other states that pass permitless carry legislation. And if we go to the next slide, we can use only the 4 states that passed permitless carry legislation in 2023 as the comparisons for all the others, and we see something really similar, which is that there's not really a change in the trend between states that between states once they pass permitless carry legislation. So it really seems like there's not much of an effect here in terms of permitless carry affecting injury rates for officers. And Michael, I'll turn it back over to you at this point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Stuart. Let's go on to the next slide, please. We're going to wrap up. We're going to nail the time here. So some basic limitations of our approach here is that we have a limited post-treatment period for recent permitless carry states. As I mentioned at the beginning, we actually have 2 more states coming online with permitless carry this year. South Carolina or Louisiana goes online in July. So this is part of ongoing work. We are going to continue coding GVA data to have longer post periods. This also means that the possibility remains that the potential, say, increase or potentially even decrease in firearm injury of police officers could manifest over a long enough time horizon. We simply don't have enough data at this point to adjudicate that. As of now, however, there isn't strong evidence that the passage of permitless carry at the state level has much of an effect on firearm injury rates of police officers. And second, we're focused on a single law, which is permitless carry passing. Of course, permitless carry can be one of several laws that are passed in a given year. And the pre-permitless carry environment, legally speaking, might be different across states. So the set of laws that exist before the passage of permitless carry also varies across states. Another part of this project is looking to code all of the existing firearm laws at the state level to see if we can compare across states even more precisely. Last slide, please. So one thing that I want you to stay on the lookout for is we are using these data. Again, we're using GVA data. I'm in the process of working with some undergraduates here to create an open source explorer, which we've called the Police Firearm Injury Explorer. This allows for people to visually navigate incidents of police officer firearm injury across the US. As you can see on the left-hand side, you can set a custom date range. You can select individual states, national, agency type, local, sheriff, state, whether it's fatal or non-fatal or both. And then you can easily export these data into CSV. We are working on getting data cleaned for the remainder of 22 and 23 before things go live. But do stay on the lookout for this particular resource, which I'm hoping to make available by the end of the calendar year. And with that, next slide, please. Thank you so much for being here. Please feel free to reach out to myself, and any feedback that is negative in any way, please direct it towards Stuart.